I want to look today at a few verses from the book of Colossians in the New Testament. And from verse 15, it says, "He, that is Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church." And the interesting thing about these verses is that it's talking about how Jesus Christ is the one who is in charge of the whole of everything, the whole of creation, the whole of the known world, the whole of history, and spiritual and temporal powers, thrones, powers, rulers, authorities. He's ahead before of everything, and in him all things hold together. And he's also the head of the body, the church. And it's funny because sometimes the church seems to have enormous power in different times in history. Sometimes the church seems a complicated kind of organisation and setup, doesn't it? I was just looking about Portugal and reading a little bit about a place called Braga in Portugal, and it says this. It's one of these famous sites, tourist sites and locations to people to visit. But it says Braga is sometimes known as the Portuguese Rome. The town is the religious capital of Portugal. At times during Portuguese history, the church has wielded more power than the monarchy or government, with Braga at the centre of its influence. And so there's this kind of power structure sometimes the church seems to have, but it's not really quite God how God intended it. It's intended that Jesus would be very much the head of the church, very much in charge of things, because he's also in charge of the world. He's in charge of political power. Everything needs to be subject to him, not be sort of representing him just in power by itself, but actually he's more interested in the people that are submitted to him, and rather than a kind of power structure, some kind of authority structure that is political and has domination over people. So God will put people in charge and in authority, and there's nothing wrong with authority in itself, but it's just an understanding and recognition that God's authority needs to be over all these things, that we need to make sure that we allow Jesus to be in charge. And even people who have political power, or church power for that matter, they need to recognize that Jesus is the head of the body, the one truly in charge. And of course, in Portugal in 1974, there was a revolution, and some of the political and church power was overturned. And so some of those different power structures, people kind of questioned whether those things were right, whether those things should have the influence and domination over society, over people in the way that they had done. And I'm interested to look at how sometimes God deals with power. We recognise that those power structures are there, but also there's lots of occasions in the Bible where those power structures are challenged, and where God says, "Okay, enough is enough. This is time." There was the king Manasseh, who did a lot of evil in the eyes of the Lord, eventually carried away as a captive. But because of the outcome of his reign, that brought the people of Israel, who are God's people, into terrible condemnation in many ways, into a situation where they had to account for those things, and they had to become quite vulnerable, actually. They experienced defeat, they experienced the overcoming power of Babylon, this enormous machine of Babylon, this great empire, marching in and going as far as Egypt. And even Josiah, who was quite a reforming king, he was in the end killed at Megiddo, where some of these many armies meet, the place that also is mentioned in regard to Armageddon, a real crossroads location in Israel. So these powers and empires and rulers and authorities on the earth, they also have to be made accountable to God. And there are times when God says, okay, I'm going to draw a line under this. It's as far as I'm concerned, this is time's up for this power. It's often a spiritual power behind things, isn't there? It's not just a person, but you see great spiritual powers at work sometimes behind things. You think about maybe the Iranian Revolution that happened, great hopes and dreams for people to have change in their nation, and yet there's a spiritual power that controls things. And amazingly, in the midst of all that, the church actually is growing rapidly. The city in the world where it's growing fastest is Tehran, the capital of Iran, where little groups are meeting. So God's kingdom keeps going. It doesn't stop. It doesn't even get controlled by these powers, but we see the work of the Holy Spirit, the work of God in these situations, much stronger than every spiritual power and every political power. And I just kind of want conscious of how, sometimes God also challenges a whole system, and we see sometimes we notice it, particularly in certain chapters in the Bible, like Ezekiel 27, where there's this great lament over Tyre, or Revelation 18 about Babylon being fallen, and we think, what is Babylon? What is this system? And God's saying about the world system, its power as it is, dependent on trade, dependent on wealth, dependent on trafficking, dependent on all sorts of different things. This system in itself is not eternal. We need to be careful how we do trade. We need to be careful how we do business, how we live our lives, how we perceive things, how our material values are, what's important for us, because all these things, although they might be amazing, are temporary. There's lots of discussion these days, isn't there, about things like trafficking, or about oppression, or whether there's injustice. Lots of discussions around that issue in many countries, and questions about it as well. Sometimes trying to get to the bottom of it is quite difficult. We see a lot of oppression and injustice that enables the great trading systems of the world to continue, and countries also being questioned about the way in which they treat people, like China, for example, has been kind of questioned. But who are we to say as well? Britain has its own history. It has its own legacy of injustice and powers that have not always been righteous and just. And God's sent people and raised up people at different times, like Wilberforce and many others, to question that. Even in our nation, we've had people like Shaftesbury questioned how children were being treated down the mines. People didn't realise what was going on. They weren't aware. They didn't know it all on social media or something. So God often put his people to stand up and be a prophetic, challenging voice and say stuff when it needed to be said. And it's amazing. I had a friend who lived in Tyre, which is in Lebanon. They actually lived there for some time, and they used to look at some of the scriptures about Tyre in the Bible, some of the verses that say pretty damning stuff, really, about that great empire that was. The Phoenicians were people who lived there. They were traders by sea. But of course, God also had great plans and purposes to restore and to renew. And so they grabbed hold of those promises as well. So although it can look bleak, it can look like these great systems of power will mean things will come crashing down, and destruction will happen. But God has always got a purpose through those things. He's always got a plan right through all this stuff. He's got a plan for the world. He's got a plan for his church to be Christ in you, the hope of glory, to be the people that God's called out to himself, that he's never saying, it's all over, it's a disaster, there's no hope, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. No, not in fact, he's always got a greater plan. We see that in the book of Revelation, the Bible, how it might be that Babylon has fallen, it might be this whole system comes crashing down around our ears, but God has a greater thing, a new city, a new Jerusalem, and a new plan for his people. So let's remember that in these times when so many things seem to be shaken. The book of Haggai, the prophet Haggai in the Old Testament, says everything that can be shaken will be shaken. But God's going to bring his glory through this. He's going to do amazing things. So if we're in a world, in a political system, in a season in the world where we've got so much shaken, governments being shaken, economic systems being shaken, health systems being shaken, so much upheaval and uncertainty, so many things that might not survive what's going on with COVID, might not survive economic crisis, might not survive this season. We just don't know what it's going to end up looking like. In the midst of all that, let's put our hope. Let's find in Christ that as he comes into our lives, as he reigns and rules in our lives, that we can find the hope of glory. We can find his hope in our hearts. We can find his purpose. We can find eternity in our hearts. We can see his greater plan. And whatever the situation, wherever it is in the world, whatever country and whatever circumstance it is, we always know God has a good plan and a purpose to bring out his people in the midst of tremendous struggles and challenges. He always has a good plan, and he has a good plan for you too, personally. He has a good plan for anybody who's watching this. Whatever your situation is, whatever the situation in your country is right now, whatever the uncertainties might be, God has a greater plan and a good purpose, and he wants to see that fulfilled.